Bless you. All right, so last time we talked about some general mechanisms of action. How do the chemical messengers actually make things happen inside the cell? And then we started talking about the endocrine system itself, which begins with the hypothalamus, which is here at the base of the brain, just to orient you. The brain is, giant thing way up there, and the pituitary sort of hangs down from the bottom of it. All right, and the hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary through this portal system. And just as a reminder, a portal system is any arterial or vessel system that has this pattern to it. So it's two capillary beds between artery and vein. Now, why is that different? Normally, there's just one, right? As we're going to learn next week and the week after, the heart pumps into arteries. Arteries get smaller and smaller and smaller until they become capillaries. Capillaries come back together and make ever bigger veins. So portal systems are unique because there's two capillary beds between heart and back to heart. So this is the first one that we're going to see. So the portal systems we're going to see are this one, which is the hypophyseal. Then we're going to see one in the GI tract. We call that the hepatic portal system. That goes through the liver. And then the third portal system we're going to see is in the kidney at the glomerulus. So you're going to hear me talk about portal systems again. This is the first one. So how is this a portal system? Because we go from artery to capillaries, back to veins, to capillaries again, and then finally back to the heart. So two capillary beds between artery and vein. All right. Let's see. Somebody just came in. It was April. Okay. Okay. So hypothalamus. Now, hypothalamus is going to release the controlling hormones that are then going to affect the pituitary. So the pituitary we divide into two sections because of its anatomy. They're different. The two sections are different. The posterior pituitary, the one in the back, we call the neurohypophysis, and that's because it looks like nervous tissue, whereas the front part looks like glandular tissue. The reason for that is the neurohypophysis actually contains the axons of neurons that are found in the hypothalamus. So the cell bodies are here, their axons are here, and what comes out of the neurohypophysis is ADH and oxytocin. So antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, and we'll talk about the hormones more in a minute. The anterior part of the pituitary here we call the adenohypophysis. Whenever you see the word adeno, you're talking about a gland. So adeno means gland-like or glandular. So here, the adenohypophysis, it looks like a gland. So like under the microscope, it looks like, the thyroid gland or the pancreas. Lots of cells, epithelial cells that are producing stuff. So the adenohypophysis produces all kinds of different hormones. So TSH, that's thyroid stimulating hormone. ACTH, which is adrenal corticotropic hormone. This triggers the release of cortisol. We're going to talk more about all of these here in a minute. FSH is follicle stimulating hormone. It's one of the reproductive system hormones. So is LH, luteinizing hormone. GH is growth hormone, important for the regulation of growth. PRL is prolactin. Prolactin really only has a role during breastfeeding. Lactose is the milk sugar, so prolactin increases lactose. It triggers milk production. And then MSH is melanocyte stimulating factor, melatonin stimulating hormone. No, I was right the first time. Melanocyte stimulating hormone. And it triggers the melanocytes in our skin's activity. So we'll talk more about all these in a minute. But all of those different hormones come from this tiny little region of the body. So from the the posterior half, or I'm sorry, the anterior half of the pituitary gland. So pituitary problems come up with some degree of frequency out there in the land of patients. And part of the reason for that is because of this very small area makes all of these important things. So you can imagine if you had a brain tumor here, that that tumor might affect all of what the adenohypophysis does. So now you have a major problem, not directly from the tumor, but because the tumor is causing problems for this hypothalamus pituitary system. All right? So the pituitary gland, neurohypophysis, adenohypophysis. All right. If you remember in A&P1, when we looked at the skull, there was that structure on the inside of the skull called the sella turcica, right? You know, the Turkish saddle. It looked like a little person could sit there. Well, what sits there in reality is the pituitary gland. So it's sort of encased in bone, and it sits in the center of the brain at the bottom of the skull in that sella turcica. So just to sort of connect with that bony landmark that we talked about a long time ago. Okay, your book does a pretty good job of going through the hormones and telling you enough about them without going into huge amounts of detail. Okay, so I would encourage you to go through their lists. You know, I think we as humans sometimes we avoid long lists of information because it seems daunting and it seems like too much. There are some lists that are not badly put together, and I think the hormone list of the book is one. All right, so ADH and oxytocin come from that posterior lobe, from the neurohypophysis. ADH is all about water control. ADH increases the amount of water that we hold on to. So when we are in a situation where we our fluid balance or our internal fluid levels are low, ADH is secreted so that the kidney holds on to every last drop that it can. Okay, so it's anti-diuretic. It reduces diuresis. Diuresis is urination, so anti-diuretic hormone. Oxytocin has two primary functions. One has to do with the delivering of the fetus from the uterus. Oxytocin stimulates uterine contraction, and more importantly, it coordinates uterine contraction so that the whole uterus contracts at once. And then the other role of oxytocin is in breastfeeding. When oxytocin is released in response to baby at the breast, the glandular cells in the mammary gland actually contract and sort of push the milk out to the baby. So one of the big differences between breastfeeding and bottle feeding is in bottle feeding, the baby has to pull the milk out of the bottle. In breastfeeding, the breast actually pushes milk towards the baby. So it's a lot easier for the child to swallow. All right, so just two hormones in the posterior lobe. It's in the anterior lobe that things start to get sort of messy. You know, we have lots of different hormones doing lots of different things. And thankfully, there are some common patterns, which we'll see here in a minute, of just what these hormones do. But first up is TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. It does just what its name implies. It stimulates the thyroid. The thyroid gland, as we'll hear about in a minute, releases thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone controls, among other things, the energy consumption rate of the body. So thyroid stimulating hormone comes from the pituitary. Its target is the thyroid, and it's going to get the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormone. All right, so that's TSH. ACTH, this is one of the hardest to pronounce. This is adrenocorticotropic hormone. Okay, what does that long mess of a word mean? Adreno is adrenal, as in adrenal glands, the suprarenal glands sitting there on top of the kidney. Cortico, it means cortex, and as we'll see here in a little while, the adrenal gland has multiple levels, and each level does something a little different. So the adrenal medulla, the inside part of the adrenal gland, that's where your epinephrine and your norepinephrine come from. The outside part of the adrenal gland, the cortex, is where the other hormones that the adrenal gland makes come from. So we call this adrenocortico because it's not targeting the medulla, it's targeting the cortex of the adrenal gland. Tropic just means to increase. So this is a hormone that increases secretions from the cortex of the adrenal gland. So adrenocorticotropic hormone. In particular, the target here is cortisol. Cortisol is a steroid hormone, which you'll hear used in treatment of all kinds of diseases. Steroids can do all kinds of good things, and they can do quite a few bad things. But they do increase survival. So the ACTH triggers the release of cortisol from the adrenal cortex, and then that cortisol goes on and has its steroid function, which we'll hear more about later. All right, so ACTH. FSH and LH are sort of grouped together because they both affect the reproductive system. So follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone play a major role in regulating the reproductive system. For example, it's follicle-stimulating hormone that triggers the development of an egg in the ovary, and luteinizing hormone is important in releasing that egg in ovulation. Now, we're not going to talk about the gonadotropins in this chapter. Instead, we're going to talk about them when we get to the reproductive system, because the system that these two hormones are part of is actually fairly complicated. So thankfully, we get to handle that one later. All right, GH is growth hormone. Again, it does just what its name implies. It's important in the regulation and stimulation of cell growth and development. Growth hormone has sort of two roles depending on which part of life you're in. In the developing fetus and child, growth hormone plays a pivotal role in actually creating the stimuli for growth. Getting taller, getting bigger, being more mature. In the adult, growth hormone has more to do with maintaining what's already grown. So maintaining muscle mass, maintaining bone strength, things like that. In addition, like growth hormone has effects on adipose tissue, epithelia, many different places. So we'll talk more about growth hormone when we get to the digestive chapter, because its effect is on the liver, and the liver then releases hormones which trigger the utilization of nutrients that are coming in through the GI tract. So that's GH, growth hormone. PRL, that's prolactin. It stimulates the development of the mammary gland as well as maintaining milk production. So prolactin levels spike after the baby is born. That triggers the production of milk several days later. And as long as breastfeeding continues, breastfeeding itself, the act of breastfeeding, actually increases prolactin release. So there's sort of a feedback mechanism. As long as you're breastfeeding, your prolactin levels will stay high and there'll be milk there for the baby. All right. And then the last one is MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone. Of all the hormones on the list, this is the one that's sort of least understood. We don't know exactly what MSH does, but we do know that when its levels go up, the melanocytes in the skin produce more melanin. Melanin is what gives the skin its color. There are a variety of different colors, and the amount of melanin that's produced varies among individuals. But that's MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone. We don't hear very much about that one. All right. So, okay, that's a fairly, lengthy list. So what happens next? The hypothalamus triggers the release of hormones by those releasing hormones, right? So the hypothalamus releases one chemical messenger, the releasing hormone, the RH, that triggers the pituitary to release the second hormone, which is an SH usually, a stimulating hormone. And then that stimulating hormone, which we're going to call hormone 1, it goes out into the body and affects some gland somewhere. That gland then produces the final hormone, which is going to affect the cells of the body. and as well as inhibiting the release of the releasing hormones or the stimulating hormones from the pituitary. So this is sort of a model. We can look at multiple hormones that have the same pattern. Okay, so releasing hormone, hormone 1, which comes from the pituitary, and then hormone 2, which comes from the target organ. So let's do an example. So for the thyroid, the hypothalamus releases thyroid-releasing hormone, TRH. It travels from here to here through that little portal system that we talked about. The TRH gets the pituitary to make TSH, thyroid-stimulating hormone. Thyroid-stimulating hormone then enters the bloodstream, travels all over the body, eventually finds the thyroid gland. And at the thyroid gland, TSH triggers the release of the thyroid hormones. So in this case, hormone 1 is TSH, and hormone 2 is the thyroid hormone. And then as thyroid hormone levels go up, it turns off the hypothalamus releasing hormones. So the system has an on switch and an off switch. You know, the on switch is when thyroid hormone is too low, the hypothalamus releases the releasing factor, which causes TSH, which increases thyroid production. All right. Same pattern for ACTH and cortisol, right? So the hypothalamus releases cortisol-releasing hormone. The pituitary, in response to that, releases ACTH. And in response to ACTH, the adrenal gland releases the glucocorticoids, like cortisol, right? And then finally, the gonadotropins, FSH and LH, they're both stimulated by the same releasing hormone, which is a little weird. But so the hypothalamus releases gonadotropin-releasing hormone. That triggers FSH and LH release. And then FSH and LH have effects at the testes and the ovaries, particularly to increase testosterone, progesterone, and estrogen release. But like I said, we're not going to talk about that in this chapter. We're going to wait till we get to the reproductive system chapter. All right, so the hormone 1, hormone 2 pattern applies to thyroid, ACTH, FSH, and LH. Okay, let's do a couple of questions here. The hypothalamus controls secretion by the anterior pituitary, which is what we were just talking about. By which of those ways? So for you new folks, what you should have gotten on your screen right about now is a question popped up with the answers anyway. The question on the screen doesn't show up on your little screen. It's too bad it doesn't, but it's too hard to do. But you get A through E. And then what I get on my screen is, it looks like this. It looks like a bar graph, and it tells me how many people picked each answer. So it gives me sort of a group sense of how the class is doing. Excuse me. All right, is that everybody? It is, good, and almost everybody picked the correct answer, which is C. Correct answer is C. So the hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary by releasing factors and inhibiting factors through that tiny little portal system, the hypophyseal portal system. Direct neural stimulation, that's how the hypothalamus controls the posterior pituitary. I mean, that's not exactly what the case is, but it's the posterior that's associated with neural, and the anterior pituitary is adeno. So anterior and adeno both start with A, so if that may help. Okay. When a catecholamine, this is from last time, or peptide hormone binds to receptors on the surface of a cell, which of those things can happen? Then I'll send you a new question. This is a question about those mechanisms of action that we talked about. How does a chemical messenger make a cell change what it does and change its activity? All right, jump in there, folks. Oh, did it kick you off, or? Okay. All right, well, then that's 7 of 8. Well, we have a split here, which isn't surprising. Those first couple of slides about the mechanisms of action are some of the hardest stuff in this whole chapter. So do take a little time and go back and look at those. But the correct answer here is C, the second messenger system. So catecholamines and peptides bind to the surface of the cell. By binding through a chain reaction, something inside the cell is either created or destroyed. So like we talked about cyclic AMP, when a receptor binds to the surface through a chain reaction through that G protein, inside the cell, cyclic AMP levels go up. So catechols and peptides go with second messenger. The A hormone receptor moves into the cytoplasm. That's the kind of thing we see with steroid hormones, just like with E, where we have effects at the nucleus. All right, we're going to skip that one. Okay. Onward. Okay, so the hormone 1, hormone 2 system is how most of the pituitary hormones work. But there are some exceptions. So like for growth hormone, we still have a releasing factor that's here, growth hormone releasing hormone, GHRH. That triggers the release of growth hormone from the pituitary. Growth hormone tells the liver to release somatomedins. So this is hormone 1, growth hormone. This is hormone 2, somatomedins. Now the difference is we have an inhibitory factor from the hypothalamus as well as a releasing factor. So in addition to our hormone 1 and hormone 2 from our model in the previous slide, we have one addition, and that's the inhibition hormone from the hypothalamus. So the somatomedins, which the liver releases in response to growth hormone, they inhibit the releasing factor and stimulate the inhibiting factor. So it makes perfect sense if you sort of work it through. If the somatomedin level is high enough, well, we want to turn off the releasing factor and turn up the inhibiting factor to reduce the amount of growth hormone that's being produced, so we keep things level. So this is sort of one difference. This has an inhibiting factor as well. In prolactin, there is no target gland. So normally we have hormone 1 that comes from the pituitary, and hormone 2 comes from some endocrine gland out there in the body. There is no prolactin secreting gland. So we have a releasing factor and an inhibiting factor, and then the prolactin has a direct effect at the breast, which is its target organ. So the path is just a little bit simpler. So just like growth hormone, there's a releasing factor and an inhibiting factor, and then prolactin inhibits the releasing factor and stimulates the inhibiting factor to keep prolactin levels in a very narrow region. So the reason that growth hormone and prolactin have an inhibiting and a releasing is controlling their levels very precisely is important. So with an inhibiting and a releasing factor, the hypothalamus can either turn a thing up or turn a thing down much more readily to keep things in control. All right, well, this is a very ugly looking thing, but as I've set up here in the corner, this really is a great study piece. This is right out of your book. This is a 2-page spread, I think. And what you're looking at, and we're not going to go through all this because we kind of already have, but here are the releasing factors from the hypothalamus. They travel through that portal system right here to the pituitary, and then these releasing factors trigger the release of the pituitary hormones, right? And then the pituitary hormones, they trigger the release of hormones from their target glands. So, for example, CRH, corticotropin-releasing hormone, triggers the release of ACTH. ACTH triggers the adrenal cortex to release glucocorticoids, right? So just like we talked about. TRH creates or brings about TSH. TSH triggers the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones. So this is a good study slide because you can sort of follow from here through the pituitary back out to the target organs, oftentimes, through an endocrine gland. All right? All right, so let's talk about the glands themselves. The pituitary is probably the most important gland in the body because it controls many of the others. But all of these are sort of critical for survival. Okay, the thyroid gland is probably the most famous endocrine organ. If you asked 100 people, name a gland in the body that produces a hormone, thyroid is going to come up very commonly. One of the reasons for that is thyroid gland problems are very common. You're going to see patients who are on thyroid medicines. You're going to see patients that have had parts of their thyroid gland removed, have had thyroid cancer or thyroid surgery. You're going to see issues with the thyroid. Anybody in here have thyroid problems that they want to admit to? So there's one, and that's about right. 1 in 20 or 1 in 30 people have some thyroid issue at some point in their life. So what is this gland that gives all this trouble? Well, it sits right here, so your Adam's apple that you can feel, and underneath there's kind of a squishy area. That squishy area is the thyroid gland. It looks a little bit like a butterfly or a bird. It has a wing on this side and a wing on this side, and then it has kind of a body in the middle called the isthmus. So there's a left lobe and a right lobe and an isthmus. It has a very rich blood supply. You can see in our picture here that there's lots of vessels that are going through this gland. And that's because the thyroid gland is secreting thyroid hormone all the time. So it needs to have a vigorous blood supply so that it can release its hormone. Because unlike some of the other glands, thyroid hormone affects every cell in the body. So we're dependent upon the thyroid gland to have normal energy metabolism. So a very rich blood supply. So the hormone they produce is stored as thyroglobulin, and it's released as thyroid hormone, so thyroxine, T3 and T4, which we'll talk more about in a minute. All right. So if we zoom in and we look at the thyroid gland under the microscope, what we see is what are called follicles. A follicle is just an empty space. And in the thyroid gland, it's filled with something. So we have cuboidal epithelial cells right here, and they surround this sort of cavity. So here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one. What's in this cavity is thyroglobulin. And thyroglobulin is pre-made thyroid hormone that is being stored. Because the body is dependent upon thyroid hormones for normal energy metabolism, it sort of keeps a reserve all the time so that it can always release enough. Okay? So thyroglobulin is stored up thyroid hormone that then the thyroid gland releases. More about how on that in just a minute. Okay? And then in between these follicles, so like in this area and this area and this area, we have clear spaces. And these clear spaces contain a different kind of thyroid cell that releases a different hormone. In this case, calcitonin. So calcitonin is part of the calcium regulation system. Calcitonin tones down calcium. In other words, it reduces calcium levels. And it comes from the thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland really has two hormones that are important that come from it. One is calcitonin controlling calcium, and the other is thyroid hormone controlling that energy metabolism. And then we'll see here in a little bit, behind the thyroid gland, up on the top and bottom and left and right, there are 4 smaller glands that produce parathyroid hormone, which is another part of the calcium management system. All right. So more on that in a minute. All right. So inside that follicle is thyroglobulin. Thyroglobulin contains T3 and T4. The T3 and T4 are the short versions of the thyroid hormone. It's actually thyroxine is T4, and T3 is, I think, just thyroglobulin. But anyway, so where does this stuff come from? So one of the unique characteristics of the thyroid gland is that iodine is very important to it. Now, iodine, if you look at the periodic table, is way over there on the right, and it's about 4 lines down. And that says that it's huge, and it is. Iodine is a huge ion. We don't see it used in the body for very many things. But this is one spot where iodine is critical. Now, where do we get iodine in our diet? Well, the way we used to get it is from seawater. Ocean water has iodine in it. So anything that you eat that came from the ocean also has iodine in it, and that iodine provides for the needs of the body. Now, as humans moved away from the oceans and towards the centers of the continents, like we are here in Omaha, center of the continent, so where on earth do we get our iodine? Well, in a lot of places, you don't get enough iodine because all the iodine is in the oceans, and if you're far from the oceans, you don't get any. So one of the things that they did in this country, and when your iodine level is too low, the thyroid gland doesn't work. Because the thyroid gland doesn't work, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. We call that a goiter. So sometimes in developing countries, you'll see people with great big swollen necks. And the reason for that is they're not getting enough iodine in their diet. So the thyroid gland doesn't work right, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So why don't we see that in America? Iodine here is added to any salt that is for consumption. So, table salt, anything except your fancy sea salt. Iodine is called iodization. So if you look at, the salt container that you buy at the store, it'll say iodized salt. That's a good thing. You want that, particularly here in Omaha, because that means that the government has added iodine to that salt to prevent the goiter. So it was a very effective public health initiative. You don't even see goiter in this country really anymore, and that's because of the iodine that's added to the salt. You might think, well, how does that work? Salt gets its way into just about everything. So even if you don't put salt on things, in the food that you eat, salt has been added somewhere along the way, and that salt that was added is usually iodized salt. So it means that we get enough iodine in our diet. You don't need very much, you just need a little, but if you don't get enough, you get this major problem. So why did I spend all that time talking about that? Because it's the iodine that is really the switch for the thyroid gland to release its hormone. There is a pump on the cell membrane of the thyroid cell here that is a pump for iodine. Specifically, it's a pump for iodide with a D-I or a I-O-D-I-D-E. That just means the negative form, the negative ion. Just like, chlorine becomes chloride. Well, for iodine, iodine becomes iodide. So this pump, it is sensitive to TSH. TSH comes from the pituitary gland, right? So when there's TSH present, the pituitary is telling the thyroid, release more thyroid hormone. Where does that TSH go? It turns on this iodide pump. Once this iodide pump is turned on, that is what triggers the release of T4 and T3 into the bloodstream. No TSH or no iodide, no release of T4 and T3. All right? Now, it's not that the iodide just stays there. Iodide is an important part of T3 and T4, so the thyroid hormones. Without iodine, these hormones don't work right either. So, kind of a complicated system, but the cell is creating thyroglobulin all the time, but then under the control of TSH, that's what triggers the release of the thyroglobulin. So the thyroglobulin is brought back into the thyroid cell. It's broken down into T4 and T3, and then T4 and T3 go out into the bloodstream and have their effects. All right, so TSH-regulated iodide pump is what controls this system. So what does TSH do? Lots of things. Oxygen consumption and energy consumption. So thyroid is sort of the accelerator hormone for the body. You know, when thyroid levels are high, the body's in high gear. You know, it's burning through energy faster. It's burning through oxygen faster. Sometimes that's good. Sometimes that's bad. That's why we need a system we can regulate, right? It's also important for maintenance of body temperature, particularly in children. So when your thyroid hormones are too low, people are their body temperature drops, as well as their activity level falls as well. So thyroid hormone plays a role in heart rate and contraction strength, blood pressure. It increases your sensitivity to sympathetic stimulation, in other words, your fight or flight response. It's important for normal respiratory function, red blood cell function, and just in general, the function of other endocrine tissues as well. So thyroid hormone is one of those, you don't want to be without it, because without thyroid hormone, you basically are dying. You know, your energy level falls very, very low, and basically your cells are turned down so low that they can't perform all the functions for life. Okay. You also don't want your thyroid levels to be too high, because then you have a tendency to be burning yourself up or out. You know, so you want to keep it level. All right, so on the back side of the thyroid gland are these four little glands called parathyroid glands. They have a very simple anatomy and physiology, which we're not even going to talk about. But what they produce is an important part of the calcium regulation system, and that is PTH, so parathyroid hormone. Of note, parathyroid hormone is not controlled by the pituitary gland. This is an exception. The calcium hormones are not controlled by the hypothalamus. They're not controlled by the pituitary. Instead, they're controlled by calcium levels. As calcium levels go up, parathyroid levels go down, and vice versa. So parathyroid hormone works to increase calcium levels, and calcitonin, which comes from the thyroid gland, helps to decrease calcium levels. So it keeps the calcium level in a very narrow range. These are glands that are fairly newly discovered. You know, like even as in the 1800s, for example, people would have thyroid surgery because their thyroid gland was overactive. So they would take out part of the thyroid gland, and unknowingly, they were taking out these parathyroid glands too. So people would end up with massive calcium problems because these glands, they didn't know that they were there. But now, when thyroid surgery is done, the parathyroid glands are always saved so that the body can still maintain a calcium level. All right. Speaking of which, okay, so calcium homeostasis. For those of you that are new to CSM, this is the first of these diagrams that you see, but there are lots of them in your book. These are the homeostasis diagrams, and of course, everybody loves them, but they are worthwhile. I mean, they do sort of show what the system, how the system works. Okay, so here's homeostasis for calcium. So you've got a calcium level of 8.5 to 11. That's where it's supposed to be. So why is calcium levels important? Calcium is one of the, I think it's underrepresented. It's important. You know, we talk a lot about sodium, we talk a lot about potassium, but calcium is what makes all the cool stuff happen. So calcium is what causes muscle contraction. Calcium ultimately is what causes nerve cells to release their neurotransmitter. Calcium is stored in the bones and released from the bones. So you want to have a calcium level that's within a narrow range so it can do all of its cool stuff. All right, so let's look at the two cases. Your calcium level is normal, and you have a particularly high calcium meal. You know, so you have a big old milkshake and something very cheesy. So your calcium levels go up from that calcium that's coming in from the digestive tract. As calcium levels go up, the thyroid gland releases calcitonin because when calcium levels are too high, calcitonin is released. Calcitonin causes an increase in calcium excretion at the kidney, so you're going to pee out calcium. You're also going to put calcium into the bones. So calcium is sort of cool because there's a storage form for it. If we have extra calcium around, we can always put it in the bones, right? Because then it's out of the bloodstream. It's not circulating anymore. But we also haven't lost it. So we get those two effects. Those cause calcium levels to go down. Peeing out calcium reduces the calcium levels. Locking it up in bone reduces the calcium levels. As those levels decline, calcitonin release goes down, and now we're back to homeostasis, right? So how about the other case? You've gone on a milk strike. You're not drinking any milk because you got sick or something like that. So your calcium levels start to fall. When the calcium levels fall, the parathyroid glands release parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone has these effects. It increases the calcium absorption from the digestive system. So you're going to pull in as much calcium as you can. It reduces calcium excretion from the kidneys. So you're going to hold on to what calcium you have. And then, importantly, it triggers the release of calcium from the bone. Because homeostatic-wise, it's better to have weak bones and a normal calcium level than to have a calcium level that's too low and have strong bones. Why? Because calcium is important to day-to-day function, moment-to-moment function. Bones are important, but you can live without them for longer than a low calcium level. So all of these things cause calcium levels to go up, which then bring the homeostasis back into play. All right, so calcium homeostasis, parathyroid hormone, and calcitonin. Okay. All right, the adrenal gland. Important endocrine gland, right? So here's right kidney, left kidney. The adrenal glands sit like little top hats or little party hats on top of the kidneys. Their new name is the suprarenal glands, but some of us, like me, don't think that that's ever going to catch on because we've all been calling it adrenal glands for too long. So there's a left and a right, and just like the thyroid gland, you see this rich blood supply, right? See all those arteries going to that small area? Same reason. You've got to have a good blood supply in order to dump those chemicals into the bloodstream and have them then circulate around the body. So very simple on the outside, but complex on the inside. Because the adrenal glands do all kinds of important things. What we're looking at here is the edge of the adrenal gland. All right, so here at the top, just to orient you, here's the capsule. So here's the top. So that is the outside, as we look at it here, right? The outside of this. And then as we go down, we're looking deeper and deeper into the adrenal gland, right? So like I said before, the adrenal gland has a cortex and a medulla. The medulla is the center part. So the medulla is way down here, and this isn't all of it for the sake of size. The medulla is actually much, much, much larger than the cortex is. But the medulla, the adrenal medulla, it does what the adrenal glands are most famous for, and that is produce epinephrine and norepinephrine in response to a fight or flight scenario. So the adrenaline rush that you get, suddenly startled by a mountain lion, that's coming from your adrenal medulla, all right? But the cortex surrounding that medulla has three types of hormones that it produces. One is the mineralocorticoids, okay, big long word there. The mineralo just means having to do with minerals. Corticoids means coming from the cortex. So these are cortex hormones having to do with minerals. Well, what the heck does that mean? Basically, we're talking about sodium and potassium. Both are minerals. They're found in water. They're found on the earth. They're found in rocks, right? So they're minerals. So aldosterone is the mineralocorticoid. It's going to control sodium and potassium levels. Now, in this chapter, we don't talk about aldosterone, because instead, we're going to talk about it when we get to the fluid and acid-base balance chapter instead. So for now, you don't have to know that one, aldosterone. And then I'm going to skip this one for a minute. This one, the zona reticularis, which sits just outside the adrenal medulla, This is where androgens are made. So androgens and estrogens are found in both genders. So in women, androgens come from this area of the adrenal gland, right? I'm not going to talk about that in this chapter either. But this middle one, we are going to talk about. So you don't have to know the zones, by the way, the zona glomerulosa again. You don't need to know those. All I'm really interested in for this chapter, you really just have to know this piece right here, the center part. And that is that the middle part of the adrenal cortex, called the zona fasciculata, that is where the glucocorticoids come from. And there's really there's three types. The most famous is cortisol. So if I'm going to ask you a question, it's probably going to be about cortisol, not the other two. But the other two are corticosterone and cortisone, which are all similar hormones with similar effects. So what do these hormones do? Well, cortisol is part of the stress response. So anytime the body is challenged, be it a fight or flight scenario, an illness, an injury of some kind, anything that threatens the body's survival, and the hypothalamus will trigger the release of ACTH. ACTH will trigger the release of cortisol. And what cortisol does is, the way I think of it is, it's a keep you alive hormone, okay? It doesn't necessarily set up your body for long-term health and survival, but it makes some changes and make it easier to stay alive in the short term. So, for example, cortisol turns the immune system down, all right? The immune system is great. We want to fight off pathogens. We want to heal very quickly. But if we're almost dead, in other words, if we're caught in the wilderness and we've got a broken leg, fighting off infection is really not that important at that moment. Survival is, right? So the immune system gets turned down by cortisol to put that energy into other places and to not have that injury affect you as much. Another thing cortisol does, the reason they're called glucocorticoids is they elevate blood sugar. There again, if you're sitting there in the woods with a broken leg, it's not really important to maintain your fat reserve at that time. You need blood sugar so you can operate, so you can do the things that you need to do. And cortisol does that. It releases basically glucose from the glucose storage areas. So those are the two primary effects, is an increase in glucose, an anti-inflammatory effect. There's also effects on practically all the other tissues of the body, but we'll focus on just those two for now. All right. And I think that's where we will stop for today. We'll hit the pancreas next time. Questions about anything? Always feel free to ask me questions. I may not have said that at the beginning. I get going, sometimes I don't stop to breathe. But please, if you have questions along the way, ask.